You guys appreciate all the support. Please click to subscribe. In this episode, I am taking a deep dive into the possibility that Nancy Guthrie was taken to Mexico. And I'm looking into the Tohono O'odham Native American Reservation. It is a massive reservation between Tucson and Mexico. A lot of people haven't talked about this, but it borders Mexico. I drove through it. Take a look at this map. This is actually from someone who knows the border and the area very well, and it shows the different ways you can get into Mexico from Tucson. Not the regulated border crossing, but other ways that you can get in. And I'm going to explain this map in a minute and what it could mean for the Nancy Guthrie investigation. I'm also talking to a retired FBI agent with experience on Indian reservations and also a retired local detective who knows the area well and how it would work sneaking someone through an Indian reservation and into Mexico from the Tucson area. First, though, let me remind you guys what happened last week. The Mexican volunteer search group Buscando Corazones Nogales says they received an anonymous tip that Nancy Guthrie was actually in a grave near the border. The Mexican authorities have said there is no evidence to support this tip, and they say that there was a search done and that nothing was located. And my sources close to the investigation have told me at this point right now, there is nothing to validate this tip. I told you guys last week, based on what I'm hearing from my sources close to the investigation, I don't think there is a reason to believe that this specific tip is going to pan out. But I do think Mexico is still in the equation overall. You just can't ignore it. It's too close to Tucson, and it's easy to get into. You guys may remember I went there a few weeks after Nancy disappeared. No one even stopped me at the border. No one checks your ID. You can just walk right into Mexico, which I'm going to show you guys again in this episode because I think it's important to kind of revisit that. But first, I want to talk with my friend, retired FBI agent Steve Moore, about the latest information regarding this search in Mexico, and specifically, again, about the Indian reservation near Tucson and New Mexico.
For joining me. Really appreciate it. I wanted to ask you, there's been some developments with the Nancy Guthrie case, specifically with Mexico. There's this volunteer group that says they got an anonymous tip that Nancy Guthrie was buried in a grave in an area near the border. And they went out and searched, and they coordinated the search with local authorities, is what we've heard. I'm just curious. But there was no FBI there. There was no Pima County Sheriff's Office there. Do you think if it was serious enough of a tip, the FBI would have been there?
Yeah, I think so. I think the Bureau is not going to ignore any legitimate tip, anything that they put some credibility into. But there's literally not enough manpower to just jump on every unverified lead, every anonymous call.
Yeah, that makes sense. The Indian reservation is right there, which I want to talk to you about. And I haven't heard a lot of people talk about this, but it's massive. And I drove through it when I was driving. When I went to Mexico from Tucson, you have to drive right through the middle of it. It's called and I hope I pronounce it right. I practiced before, but the Tohono O'odham Nation.
Yes.
And there's this map that we have. I mean, there are ways to get into Mexico. Everybody just thinks Nogales, the main point of entry, where, it's like the whole border patrol setup and everything. But there are other ways, and the Indian reservation does border Mexico. Do you think that that's something that the FBI is considering?
I think you would have to consider that as part of your overall understanding of possibilities. Hypothetically, it could have gone north to Minnesota. You have to have a global reach, a global concept of what could have happened. And certainly the proximity to the border is something that they're going to take a strong look at. But that doesn't mean that because it's a possibility or looks like an obvious way to take someone out of the country, that the person did. You're looking for some type of indication or evidence that would indicate that they did that. You don't have enough manpower simply to just start searching the desert.
Mm. If you were trying to get out without anybody seeing you, though, and you had Nancy, wouldn't the Indian reservation be a good way to do that?
The reservation would be a way to would be one way of doing it. The deal with the reservation is that they notice people who aren't from there. It is extremely rural. It's almost desolate in places where you could go miles without seeing any kind of residence, any kind of structure. So yeah, that's part of it. But at the same time, if anybody does see you and doesn't recognize you, you're going to stand out, especially if there's two or three of you, or the vehicle is going to be a big deal. It's much easier to go on foot and not be seen, but that's going to be very difficult if you're trying to move somebody who may not be assisting in their movement.
Yeah, and I want to talk to you more about the vehicle in a second. But with the Indian reservation, how does it work like with the FBI? Can they go question people on an Indian reservation? Can they go review surveillance video from the border near the Indian reservation? Like, what's the cooperation like there?
Well, what their authority is and what the cooperation is are kind of two different things. My dad and I, when he was an agent, and me when I was an agent, we were the for a different reservations. We were the FBI agents who covered those reservations. And here's the issue: within an Indian nation or a Native American nation, there are it is essentially governed by federal law. There is, I mean, they have tribal law, but the federal government also covers it. And so an FBI agent technically has authority for every crime. People say, well, FBI agents don't investigate murder or don't investigate rape or anything like that. On a reservation, they do, because the FBI has total law enforcement jurisdiction on those nations. And by total, I don't mean they're the only law enforcement, but I mean they have jurisdiction right down to speeding, if they chose to exercise that. So yes, number one, the FBI operates frequently inside these lands. But at the same time, there are certainly there's some pushback from the tribes, from the nations, in that they sometimes don't want federal agents in there. And in fact, some of the FBI's most difficult cases and cases where FBI agents have been murdered have occurred on Indian Nation land, such as Wounded Knee and things like that.
So I was wrong. I always thought like an Indian nation, they had their own laws essentially and their own courts and their own. I didn't realize that the FBI had jurisdiction over their land too.
Yeah, and by jurisdiction, I mean it's not like we come in and try to exert authority over the situation, but we are an investigative agency which has jurisdiction over federal land, and in though it is a tribal nation's land, the federal government still has law enforcement jurisdiction within it.
When you look at the map of this Native American land, it's a huge blob right there near where Nancy disappeared from, between where she is essentially and the border. So I would imagine they must be it must be somehow involved in the investigation, do you think? Like, do you think FBI agents have been out there at all asking around or?
Yeah, there'll be a an agent that is assigned to that nation, to those lands, and the tribal police and the authorities, the nation's own authorities, will know the names of the agents. They'll have dealt with them frequently, and so it would generally be put to a situation where you as an FBI agent who was covering this land, you would go to the tribal police, to the authorities there, and explain what you're looking for and ask for any cooperation if anybody has seen anything. But you're likely not going to bring an FBI task force in and start searching unless you have a good reason to.
Wouldn't it be easier for someone trying to get away with Nancy to go to cross the border through the reservation versus the big checkpoint? I mean, I was there with all the cameras.
Yeah, but I think people do. I mean, the short answer for me, and this is an opinion, I would rather try to get across the border through the traffic lanes than I would like to go across the tribal lands and get into Mexico that way, for several reasons. Number one, there are what they call smart walls down in that area. There are these huge bollard fences that we always see when you see news shots of, the Trump wall and this kind of stuff. Those are active down there, and they have a lot of features besides just being a physical barrier. They are monitored by cameras almost the entire length. They've got sensors that we are unaware of. They actually, in southern New Mexico, they have a heliostat, basically a dirigible or some type of balloon that is tethered thousands of feet up, that watches that entire area and watches for air traffic and vehicle traffic. It would be very difficult to go down south of the border on a vehicle in that area because there are fences, there are vehicle barriers there, and you bring up a plume of smoke or plume of dust. And what you should what we can look at as an indication of how difficult that would be is the fact that the people who bring immigrants up into America illegally across the border there, they don't use vehicles to cross the border because they are too easy to see, and people come across in large groups on foot, and if they're using a vehicle, they'll try to sneak it through a border crossing.
Interesting. So it's not as easy as it sounds, just getting on the reservation and crossing.
It's easier. It's almost as easy as it seems to get onto the reservation, but it's a lot more difficult than it seems to get across the border. I mean, even at night, they have helicopters flying up and down the border with night vision, and it's a thing.
Did you say you were the liaison between a reservation and the FBI at one point?
Yeah, the Ute tribe in the Uinta Mountains in Utah, and then my dad, when I was just a kid, we lived in Arizona, and he covered part of the Navajo Nation, which is on the opposite side of the state.
Did you find that they were cooperative most of the time, or did they kind of want to protect their own?
Um, it could be that they would try to protect some of their own, but it's like any town. You have some people who say this guy's a crook, and others who say, but he's our crook, and don't let the outsiders come in and tell us how we're going to deal with this. Um, I I remember arresting the police chief in part of the Ute Nation for for crimes against other members of the nation. And the people were happy. Some people were happy about that because he had become kind of a bully. So yeah, there's cooperation, but there are times and nations where there may be long-standing history where they don't like the FBI, much like the sheriff apparently didn't like the FBI. So I can't tell you offhand whether there is a cordial working relationship with that tribe, but I will tell you that it is delicate at the best of times.
If you're watching this for the first time and you care about true crime cases that actually matter, cases where real people are still missing, and real families are still waiting for answers, then you are in the right place. Make sure you hit that subscribe button right now and give this video a like so that more people can find this story. This is True Crime Dav, and we do not let cases like this disappear into silence. To understand the Nancy Guthrie case, you first have to understand the place where it unfolded. Tucson, Arizona is a city of roughly 1 million people sitting in the Sonoran Desert, surrounded by mountain ranges that rise dramatically from the flat desert floor. It is a city with a unique character, part university town, part military hub, part border community. It sits in Pima County, one of the largest counties by area in the entire United States. And its southern edge reaches toward a border that has been the subject of national debate, political controversy, and law enforcement challenges for decades. The city itself is not isolated. It has a major airport, an interstate highway system, and all the infrastructure of a modern American metropolitan area. But step outside the city limits in the right direction, and within a very short distance, the landscape transforms into something ancient and unforgiving. Saguaro cacti stand like sentinels across rolling hills of rock and scrub brush. The heat in summer can reach temperatures that are genuinely life-threatening, and the space, the sheer, overwhelming, silent space, stretches in every direction as far as the eye can see. This is the geography that investigators were forced to reckon with when Nancy Guthrie disappeared. Because in a disappearance case, geography is not just background. Geography is everything. It determines where a person could have gone, how quickly they could have traveled, who might have seen them, and whether evidence might survive the conditions long enough to be discovered. Nancy Guthrie's disappearance set off an investigation that would involve multiple law enforcement agencies, generate significant community concern, attract the attention of volunteer search groups on both sides of the border, and raise questions that official statements seemed unable or unwilling to fully answer. The case became public in a way that disappearance cases often do in the social media era, with investigators, journalists, and private citizens all attempting to fill in the blanks that official channels left empty. From the beginning, one geographical reality dominated the conversation surrounding this case. Mexico was close. Not just close in the way that a neighboring state is close. Close in the way that changes the entire calculus of a missing person investigation. When a person disappears within 60 miles of an international border, a border that, as we will discuss in detail, can be crossed without significant impediment, every investigative assumption changes. The question of where someone might have gone is no longer limited to the domestic geography of Arizona. The map suddenly expands to include an entire other country with different legal systems, different law enforcement agencies, different levels of cooperation with American authorities, and different political motivations for either helping or deflecting. Investigators and community members following the Nancy Guthrie case were confronted almost immediately with the Mexico question. And almost immediately, the Mexican government began issuing statements that would become a recurring source of controversy throughout the investigation. From very early in the case, some felt far too early, given how little time had passed to conduct any meaningful investigation. Mexican authorities began publicly stating that they did not believe Nancy Guthrie had been brought into Mexico. They denied any connection to the case. They distanced their country from the investigation with a consistency and speed that struck many observers as premature at best and politically motivated at worst. To understand why Mexico would respond this way, you have to understand the political and diplomatic context. The idea that someone could commit a crime in the United States, abduct a person, and then use Mexico as an escape corridor or a place to conceal a victim is deeply uncomfortable for the Mexican government. It carries implications about the security of the border, the capacity of Mexican law enforcement, and the overall safety of the country, implications that have real economic and diplomatic consequences. Mexico's tourist industry, its trade relationships, its diplomatic standing with the United States, all of these are sensitive to narratives about criminality and lawlessness near the border. So when a high-profile missing person case from Tucson, Arizona starts generating speculation about Mexico, the Mexican government has strong institutional incentives to push back against that narrative. But the problem with Mexico's early and emphatic denials is a logical one. You cannot prove a negative of this kind. You cannot say definitively that a person is not somewhere in a country as large and varied as Mexico without an investigation of impossible scope. Saying Nancy Guthrie is not in Mexico is not a statement that can be supported by evidence. It is a political statement dressed up as an investigative conclusion. And the difference between those two things matters enormously when a person's life and whereabouts are at stake. Months into the investigation, a development emerged that thrust the Mexico angle back into the spotlight with new intensity. A Mexican volunteer search group called Buscando Corazones Nogales, which translates roughly to searching for hearts Nogales, announced that they had received an anonymous tip. The tip claimed that Nancy Guthrie was buried in a grave in an area near the border on the Mexican side. The group mobilized and conducted a search, reportedly in coordination with local Mexican authorities who oversaw the operation. The result of that search was nothing. No remains were found. No evidence supporting the tip was discovered. Mexican authorities subsequently issued a formal statement saying that the claims made by representatives of the search collective currently lacked verifiable supporting evidence. And sources close to the investigation on the American side confirmed that there was, at that point, nothing to validate the specific information contained in the tip. But the story does not end there, because the response to this search from American law enforcement revealed something deeply troubling about the state of communication in this investigation. Pima County Sheriff's Office issued a statement after the search became public. The statement said that they were aware of reports regarding the anonymous tip, that the investigation remained active and ongoing, and that they would continue to follow up on any credible information. Reasonable enough on its surface. But buried within that statement was a single phrase that stopped observers cold. The statement noted that, at that time, Pima County Sheriff's Office had not been contacted by Mexican authorities. Stop and consider what that means. Mexico had conducted a search, overseen by its own local authorities, related to a case that originated in Pima County, Arizona. And the Pima County Sheriff's Office, the lead investigating agency for Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, had not received a single communication from Mexican authorities about it. Not a phone call, not an email, not an official notice through any diplomatic channel. The two sides of the border were operating in complete isolation from each other on a case that may have crossed that very border. This communication failure was not an isolated incident. It reflected a pattern that had been developing throughout the investigation. The relationship between Pima County Sheriff's Office and the Federal Bureau of Investigation had itself been characterized by friction and tension. Reports and signals from within the law enforcement community suggested that coordination between the local and federal agencies was not seamless. The FBI had, through its own careful public statements, indicated awareness that information was not flowing freely between agencies. This pattern, local agency, federal agency, foreign government, all investigating the same case without fully communicating with each other, represents one of the most fundamental obstacles in cases that cross jurisdictions. And this case crossed multiple jurisdictions simultaneously. It crossed from local to federal. It crossed from American to potentially international. And it crossed into one of the most uniquely complex jurisdictional spaces in American law, the territory of a federally recognized Native American nation. Because sitting directly between Tucson and the Mexican border, covering an enormous swath of the Sonoran Desert, lies the Tohono O'odham Nation. And this piece of the geographic puzzle is one that received far less public attention than it deserved. The Tohono O'odham Nation is one of the largest Native American reservations in the United States. It encompasses approximately 2.8 million acres of desert land, making it comparable in size to the state of Connecticut. It stretches across southern Arizona and shares a border with Mexico that runs for roughly 62 miles. If you drive from Tucson toward the Mexican border crossing at Nogales using certain routes, you drive directly through the Tohono O'odham Reservation. There is no way around it. The reservation sits between the city and the border, like a vast, silent corridor. The terrain within the reservation is some of the most remote and desolate in the continental United States. There are stretches where you can drive for miles without seeing a single structure, a single person, a single sign of habitation. The landscape is rugged. The roads in more remote areas are unpaved and challenging, and the environment itself is hostile to human survival without proper preparation. This is not a place where strangers pass unnoticed, at least not in the areas where people do live. The community knows itself. Unfamiliar faces, unfamiliar vehicles, and unusual activity register in ways that they might not in a large anonymous city. From a law enforcement perspective, the Tohono O'odham Nation presents a unique jurisdictional situation that many people outside the legal and law enforcement community do not fully understand. Because of the federal government's relationship with recognized Native American nations, the FBI actually holds law enforcement jurisdiction over crimes committed on reservation land. This is not the same as local or state jurisdiction. The FBI has authority on reservation land that extends to serious crimes, including murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault, that would typically fall under state jurisdiction elsewhere. FBI agents have been regularly assigned to cover specific reservations, building relationships with tribal police and tribal governments over time. The Tohono O'odham Nation has its own tribal police force and its own governance structure. The relationship between tribal nations and federal law enforcement is a complicated one, shaped by centuries of difficult history. There are cases where tribal authorities and federal agents work closely and cooperatively. There are other cases where the historical weight of broken treaties, forced relocations, and federal overreach creates an atmosphere of distrust that complicates cooperation. The reality is that no blanket characterization applies. Each relationship is its own negotiation, its own balance of sovereignty and practicality. What this means for the Nancy Guthrie investigation is that any inquiry into activity on the Tohono O'odham Reservation would need to be handled with both legal authority and diplomatic sensitivity. An FBI agent assigned to the nation would approach tribal police through established channels, explain what they were looking for, and request cooperation in gathering information. A full-scale search operation on reservation land, however, would require something more: credible, specific evidence pointing to that location. Geographic proximity alone is not sufficient justification for a large-scale federal operation on sovereign tribal land. The question that naturally arises is whether the reservation could have served as a corridor, a route through which someone could have moved Nancy Guthrie from Tucson toward the Mexican border without detection. This theory, while geographically logical on the surface, becomes significantly more complicated when examined in detail. There are aspects of the reservation that would make it theoretically attractive for someone attempting to move a person without being observed. The vast empty stretches of terrain, the absence of frequent law enforcement patrols across its entire expanse, the lack of commercial surveillance infrastructure that characterizes more urban environments, all of these create conditions that might seem to offer cover for criminal activity. But experts familiar with border security and the terrain of southern Arizona point to countervailing factors that make this route far more difficult than it might appear on a map. The border in this area is not an open, unmonitored line in the sand. Technology and infrastructure have transformed border security in ways that are not always visible to the casual observer. What are sometimes called smart walls in this region incorporate physical barriers, cameras monitoring extended stretches of the border, ground sensors that detect vibration and movement, and aerial surveillance assets that operate continuously. In the airspace over southern Arizona, surveillance has extended to include aerostats, large tethered balloons, or blimp-like craft positioned thousands of feet in the air that provide persistent surveillance of wide areas below, monitoring for vehicle traffic, foot traffic, and aircraft. These assets mean that vehicle crossings in remote areas are far more likely to be detected than most people assume. A vehicle moving across open desert raises a dust plume visible for considerable distance. The combination of physical barriers, sensors, cameras, and aerial surveillance creates a detection environment that is genuinely difficult to defeat. Law enforcement and border security experts note that criminal organizations engaged in cross-border smuggling, organizations with far more resources, experience, and local knowledge than the average individual, have largely abandoned attempts to move vehicles across the border in remote desert areas precisely because of these detection capabilities. Instead, smuggling operations on foot, moving people and contraband through the desert in large groups, have become more common. And even these operations face significant interdiction efforts. What this means for the theory that Nancy could have been moved through the reservation and across the border is that such an operation would have been logistically extremely difficult. Moving a person who is not cooperating in their own transport through remote desert terrain on foot across a border with continuous aerial and ground surveillance represents a challenge that most individuals would be unable to execute successfully. This does not mean it is impossible, but it means the geographic convenience of the reservation route is significantly diminished by the operational realities of the border environment. The more operationally viable border crossing point, paradoxically, may have been the regulated crossing at Nogales, hiding within the ordinary flow of pedestrian and vehicle traffic that passes through that checkpoint daily. American border infrastructure is primarily designed to detect and prevent people and contraband from entering the United States. The scrutiny applied to those leaving the country is far less intensive. Someone crossing into Mexico at Nogales faces far less inspection than someone crossing in the opposite direction. This is a reality that investigators and border security analysts acknowledge openly, and it represents a genuine vulnerability in the border framework that a knowledgeable person could potentially exploit. The anonymous tip that sent Buscando Corazone's Nogales into the desert near the border deserves further examination, not because the specific tip appears to have been validated, but because of what the response to it revealed about the state of this investigation. Anonymous tips in high-profile missing person cases are common. Most of them do not pan out. The challenge for law enforcement is determining which tips merit significant resource allocation and which do not, a judgment call that requires weighing the specificity of the information, the plausibility of the scenario described, and the potential cost of acting versus not acting. In this case, the tip was specific enough to generate a physical search. The volunteer group took it seriously enough to organize, travel to the location described, and conduct a search with the involvement of local Mexican authorities. Yet neither the FBI nor Pima County Sheriff's Office appears to have sent personnel to participate in or observe the search. The FBI's position, expressed through various statements and signals, is that the agency cannot deploy resources to every anonymous, unverified tip in an ongoing investigation. This is a reasonable institutional position. The Bureau operates across thousands of active investigations simultaneously with finite personnel. But the absence of any American law enforcement presence at a search that was being conducted on foreign soil related to an American citizen's disappearance, in coordination with foreign authorities, that absence raises questions about whether the communication channels between American and Mexican authorities were functioning at all. The fact that Pima County Sheriff's Office subsequently stated they had received no contact from Mexican authorities about the search seems to confirm that those channels were not functioning effectively in this case. This is the kind of institutional failure that does not make headlines on its own. It is not dramatic. There is no single moment of incompetence to point to. It is instead the quiet, grinding failure of bureaucratic systems to communicate across their own boundaries. A failure that, in the context of a missing person case, can have consequences that no one can fully measure. One of the most significant questions surrounding the Nancy Guthrie investigation concerns what evidence, if any, exists regarding the mechanics of her disappearance. What vehicle, or vehicles, might be connected to the case? What surveillance footage might have been captured in Tucson in the hours surrounding her disappearance? What witnesses, if any, saw something relevant and have either reported it or chosen to remain silent? These are questions that the public record does not fully answer. Investigations of this kind are conducted with information held closely by law enforcement, shared selectively with prosecutors, and released to the public only when investigative strategy permits. The absence of detailed public information about the physical evidence in the Nancy Guthrie case is not unusual, but it creates a frustrating gap between what investigators know and what those following the case from the outside can understand. What can be said with confidence is that the investigation has remained active. Official statements from Pima County Sheriff's Office have consistently characterized the investigation as ongoing. The FBI's involvement signals the seriousness with which federal authorities are treating the case, regardless of the tensions between agencies. Surveillance video from the Tucson area, from the borders of the Tohono O'odham Reservation, from the Nogales Crossing, and potentially from Mexican territory has likely been gathered and analyzed by investigators, even if the results of that analysis have not been made public. The desert itself poses challenges to evidence collection that go beyond the logistical. In the Sonoran Desert, the environment is actively hostile to the preservation of many types of evidence. Extreme heat, wind, wildlife activity, and the sheer scale of the terrain all work against the discovery and preservation of material evidence. Cases in similar geographic contexts have demonstrated that years can pass between a person's disappearance and the discovery of meaningful physical evidence, and sometimes that evidence is never found at all. What has emerged most clearly from this case, more clearly, perhaps, than any specific theory about what happened to Nancy, is a portrait of the profound complexity that surrounds missing person investigations in border regions. The Tucson area sits at the intersection of competing jurisdictions, complex sovereign relationships, international political sensitivities, and one of the most challenging physical environments in the country. Law enforcement agencies at multiple levels must navigate these overlapping layers simultaneously while conducting what is, at its most fundamental level, a search for a human being who deserves to be found. The Tohono O'odham Nation is not simply a geographic feature on a map between Tucson and Mexico. It is a sovereign political entity with its own governance, its own law enforcement, its own history, and its own relationship with the federal government that shapes every interaction. Mexico is not simply a neighboring country. It is a sovereign nation with its own law enforcement priorities, its own political calculations, its own institutional pride, and its own history of complicated relations with American law enforcement that colors every communication. Pima County Sheriff's Office is not simply a local law enforcement agency. It is an institution operating under public scrutiny, managing media attention, and making strategic decisions about what information to release and what to hold close. The FBI is not simply a federal investigative agency with superior resources. It is an institution with its own jurisdictional guidelines, its own diplomatic considerations, and its own calculus about how to allocate finite investigative resources across an enormous caseload. All of these institutions, with all of their individual interests and constraints, are supposed to be working toward the same goal: finding Nancy Guthrie, understanding what happened to her, and delivering justice. Whether they are succeeding in that coordination is a question that honest observation of the publicly available record does not allow us to answer with confidence. What we know, stripped down to its most basic elements, is this: Nancy Guthrie disappeared in the Tucson, Arizona area. The investigation that followed has involved Pima County Sheriff's Office as the lead local agency and the FBI as a federal partner. The proximity to the Mexican border made Mexico an early focus of investigative interest. Mexican authorities have consistently denied any connection to the case from early in the investigation. A volunteer search group in Mexico received an anonymous tip claiming Nancy was buried near the border, conducted a search with local Mexican authority involvement, and found nothing. Pima County Sheriff's Office stated they had not been contacted by Mexican authorities, revealing a significant communication gap. The Tohono O'odham Nation Reservation sits between Tucson and the border and represents a unique jurisdictional and geographic element of the case. The border in the reservation area is more heavily monitored by technology than its remote appearance suggests. And the case, as of the most recent available information, remains unresolved. What we do not know is far larger than what we know. We do not know with certainty where Nancy Guthrie is. We do not know whether she is alive. We do not know whether she was moved across any border, through any reservation, or in any specific direction after her disappearance. We do not know what physical evidence investigators have gathered, or what conclusions that evidence supports. We do not know whether the anonymous tip that sent a volunteer group into the Mexican desert came from someone with genuine knowledge of the case or from someone with other motivations. We do not know whether the jurisdictional tensions visible in the public record have materially impacted the investigation's effectiveness. What we owe Nancy Guthrie, and what we owe every person who disappears under circumstances like these, is the refusal to let their story be swallowed by the noise of speculation, political maneuvering, and institutional inertia. The failure to find someone does not mean the failure to care. The silence of official statements does not mean the silence of public interest. The complexity of the investigation does not mean the impossibility of the truth eventually emerging. Cases like this one have a way of breaking open in unexpected ways. A piece of surveillance footage that was initially overlooked. A witness who finally decides to speak. A detail that connects to another detail in a way that suddenly makes the larger picture clear. The desert keeps its secrets for a long time, but not forever. The border, for all its complexity, is not an impenetrable wall against the truth. Nancy Guthrie was a person with a life, with people who loved her, with a story that extended far beyond the moment of her disappearance. She deserves the full weight of investigative effort from every agency with jurisdiction or capability to contribute to finding her. She deserves communication between those agencies rather than the siloed, fragmented approach that the public record suggests has characterized this investigation. She deserves the kind of relentless attention that refuses to let her case age into obscurity. And the people who follow cases like this one, who pay attention, who share information, who keep the conversation alive, play a role in that. Public interest keeps resources allocated. Media attention keeps cases from being quietly deprioritized. The communities that refuse to let a person's disappearance become yesterday's news are part of the mechanism of accountability that pushes institutions to keep working. The Nancy Guthrie case is not over. The investigation is ongoing. The truth has not yet been found. But the questions being asked about Mexico, about the reservation, about the border, about the communication between agencies, about the anonymous tip, about the silences within official statements, these questions matter. They reflect the kind of rigorous, sustained attention that this case demands. They reflect the understanding that 60 miles is not very far when someone's life is at stake. That a border is not an answer and not an obstacle to the truth, but simply a line on a map that the truth will eventually cross. We will continue following this case. Every development, every new piece of information, every shift in the investigation will be brought to you here with the depth and care that this story deserves. Because Nancy Guthrie is not a statistic. She is not a theory. She is a person. And she is still missing. If this video gave you a deeper understanding of this case, and what it means for Nancy Guthrie, and for everyone who loves her, please take a moment right now to give this video a like, and subscribe to True Crime Dav. Your support is what makes it possible to keep covering cases like this one. Cases that matter. Cases where the truth is still out there waiting to be found. Hit the subscribe button, turn on your notifications so you never miss an update, and share this video with anyone who cares about justice, about missing persons, and about the kind of storytelling that refuses to look away. This is True Crime Dav. We will be back with more.